we can characterize Shakespeare's plays and those of his contemporaries on their usage of a broad range of grammatical features. Basically, we'll be looking at different grammatical features that Shakespeare uses and compare them to his contemporaries. So for this, we'll be using, don't know why, these are all off. We'll be using both the First Folio Plus as obviously Shakespeare's work, and we'll compare it to the comparative plays corpus. We will not be that these pop up in his work and will be different from other authors, right? And in their list of features that could possibly be studied for this, they include a whole set of grammatical categories, features, and constructions from all. Like I said, we'll be looking at the First Folio Plus and the comparative plays just because they're really easy to compare and to see if there's any difference. So we're hoping, obviously, that there is a small difference between what Shakespeare does and what his contemporaries do in terms of grammar. And for this, we obviously use CQP Web. We use different search terms for the simple features. So, for example, this is how we look for all nouns. This is the part of speech tag for nouns with the asterisk meaning all nouns. And then we also took a bit further because for the more complex, smaller features that we were looking at. This is, for example, how you would look at the, I think it's the perfect aspect verb. So we came up with these more complex constructions, which are the CQP Web query syntax.
Yeah, this is the full CQP syntax,
Yeah.
whereas the simpler ones use the simple query syntax, which is what you get by default.
Yeah, and these map on almost perfectly to Viber's features. And if you look at that, these are some of the numbers that you find. In orange, you can see Shakespeare's numbers, and in blue, you see what his contemporaries do. As you can see, overall, there's not really that much of a difference, but Andrew will further go in more detail of all of these features and highlight some of the things that might actually be more interesting than this look like at first look.
Yeah, so the reason that we titled this presentation, well, we put variability in, is because we had the very strong suspicion, which in several cases was confirmed, that what was going to be interesting in comparing Shakespeare to these other guys was not the differences between the averages, because you can see there's not a lot of difference between the averages. What we were suspected would be of interest would be more to do with the range of values that differentiate different plays, because if plays are characterized by their own style to some extent, then we would expect the variation to spread out the plays, both in Shakespeare and in the comparative playwrights corpus. And the question then arises, well, where is Shakespeare spread relative to the spread exhibited by the comparative corpus? Is Shakespeare at one end or at the other end, or is it a wider spread, or is it a narrower spread? What's going on? So, we first had a quick look at with the part of speech categories only, just to see where the variation is, and where the variation is largely there. Now the categories that are the yellow and orange, the red and orange are adverbs and adjectives, and they bob up and down a lot. But what's causing them to bob up and down a lot really is the frequency of pronouns and nouns. So that was kind of our first hint that we ought to be paying attention to the nouns. So that was a start. What we did then was, for each of the features, for each of the easy features, if you like, the main part of speech categories, we plotted out what is the spread. So let me just explain what you're looking at here. You're looking at all the plays from both groups lined up in ascending order of how much use they make of a particular grammatical feature. And the blue lines are plays from the comparative corpus, and the, what do you call that? It's kind of pinky red. The pinky red bars are Shakespeare's plays. So in this case, you can see that the very top and the very bottom is just comparative, but then for the rest of the spread, you've got the two kind of mixed together pretty much. So I would say there's not a great deal to write home about here. I'm going to take you very, very quickly through the equivalent graphs for the other part of speech features. So that's verbs, that's nouns, and you'll notice that things are a bit different there. I'm going to come back to that. And there's adjectives, adverbs. You might say there that Shakespeare's spread is kind of narrower than the rest. Pronouns and determiners. So again, something seems to be going on here, and what we could say relative to that is, what we could say based on that is that relative to the other playwrights, Shakespeare's plays tend less towards the heavily nominal style, and what we saw on the graphs for nouns and for determiners seem to reflect this. Now that's interesting because the heavily nominal style, using lots of actual nouns and relatively, that usually implies relatively fewer pronouns as well, has been connected to differentiation of speech and writing in modern English. More or less anyone who does any research on speech versus writing will eventually hit the nouniness of the text as a feature. And it's interesting that that's present, and it's interesting that it seems to differentiate Shakespeare from the rest. Otherwise, though, there's not a huge amount to say. Shakespeare's plays present more or less the same range of values for these grammatical features as do the other playwrights' works. In statistical terms, for those of you who like statistics, I should point out that we're kind of flying here without the safety net of significance tests and such like, so we don't want to over-interpret, since we're not dealing with statistically tested data. Once again, I shall spin through at very high speed the lined up in order graphs for the other features that we looked at, the other 9 features. That's 9 out of a much longer list that you find in Biber, and the Leach and Shaw outline is much longer than that. You might ask, when are you going to do the rest? And the answer is between now and when we submit the journal article. So there's past tense verbs, there's perfect aspect. Now you can see there that there does actually seem to be a division. That's present tense verbs. First person pronouns, second person pronouns, third person pronouns, just the personal ones, not any others. And that complement clauses as complements of verbs. And again, that's kind of interesting. Finally, infinitives, which is also kind of interesting. Oh, not finally. I should never say finally when I can't remember exactly how many slides I've got. So these are WH clauses as complements of verbs. So he said what it was or something like that. Okay, so what does all this show? Well, first of all, not everything is interesting. I suppose this is a. I was about to say this is a truism of corpus research. I don't think it is a truism of corpus research, but it certainly ought to be, so it is now my mission to make it one. Not everything is interesting. When you have the ability to find numbers on anything, and you find numbers on everything, then not all of those are going to bear on interesting phenomena. They're just not. And a lot of what we saw was just a mix of Shakespeare's plays and the other plays, which is unsurprising because they're all plays from the same period. So yeah, they're similar. However, there are some things that hint at interesting differences, which emerges more for these more fine-grained features than when we're looking purely at the part of speech tagged as grammatical, as major parameters of grammatical variation. So one interesting thing was first-person pronouns. I was talking to Alison briefly about this. Where's Alison? Oh, there you are. Yes. So I apologise if I got this wrong, but apparently there's been some discussion in kind of like the literature, the literary studies of the period, about how the notion of an inner consciousness emerged before in a pre-Cartesian period. So that's before I think, therefore I am. And some people have said that Shakespeare was doing something with this, and other people have said that he wasn't. And in that view, the actual lack of a clear distinction between Shakespeare and others in terms of first-person pronouns is interesting, because it might defy some people's expectations of what they would see there. However, perhaps if we go beyond that, going beyond those, there are a few features where Shakespeare's plays seem to lean towards one end of the available variation. Perfect aspect, third-person pronouns, and that complement clauses. The Shakespearean plays seem to be more on the upper end than on the lower end in terms of the complete distribution of plays. And infinitives seems to be on the lower end, so that reflects grammatical choices that other playwrights seem to be more likely to favour. Now, it's very difficult to make any kind of firm comment here, because often you would want to have other features included in the analysis that represent alternative choices there. So the interesting thing with the perfect aspect, for instance, is that we haven't found anything that tends the other way, right? So, you know, if we're trying to argue that, oh, that's interesting, then, well, what's the opposite? What's the balance? Because there has to be a balance. A positive difference can't emerge unless there's a negative difference somewhere else. But we're certainly starting to tease out some interesting differences. And again, this is not in terms of average use. It's in terms of how much of the variability, how much of the range of variability is being made use of in the different corpora. So how do we address variability? Well, there's various ways that we can approach. And one is to look at the ranges. Now, looking at range wasn't terribly easy with the graphs that we've shown you so far. And a second one is distinguishing between the different genres of plays. So for instance, we might say, well, it looks like Shakespeare is on average the same as all the rest, but that's kind of like throwing together a load of different genre plays in Shakespeare and a lot of different genre plays in the comparative corpus as well. So, although we haven't got time here to present this for everything we did the analysis for, we've got time to present you with one or two. So let's start with this. So this is perfect aspect. When you said perfect aspect verbs, my grammarian's eyeball started twitching, because perfect aspect is not a feature of verbs, it's a feature of verb phrases.
I'm sorry.
Isolde's not a grammarian. And so what this plots is, instead of putting the bars in order of in ascending order, it's all the Shakespeare ones at this end and all the non-Shakespeare ones at this end, with the Shakespeare ones also grouped comedies, histories, and tragedies. Okay? And for each one, I've put a horizontal bar for the lowest and another horizontal bar for the highest. Now, the bars are quite thick, so they're not 100% precise, but I thought it was more important for you to see what was going on to get it, you know, on the dot. We will actually, obviously, put the exact figures in the paper when we get to that point. But what you can see is that for the perfect aspect, Shakespeare's lowest point seems to be about the same for comedies, tragedies, and histories. But the highest point seems to vary a lot. For the tragedies, it's up and down all over the place, so you've got a very wide window. For the comedies, you've got a narrow window, and then, for the histories, you've got a narrow window, and then for the tragedies, comedies, oh my word. I've said these three words too often today, that's my problem. For the comedies, you've got a window somewhere in between. How does that compare to the comparative corpus? Well, you can see that the range in the comparative corpus is wider. And although there are slightly more plays in the comparative corpus, my hunch is that that alone cannot account for the range being wider. Because you can see quite a lot of plays nudging that top end of the range. Likewise, there's at least 3 or 4 nudging the bottom end of the range. So it does seem to be that there is something notable happening with the range of variation there. And what this can do is it can help us get an insight into the stylistic constitution of not only comedy, history, and tragedy, but also the stylistic constitution of specifically Shakespeare's comedies, Shakespeare's history, Shakespeare's tragedies. And again, I know I would like to have a more all-encompassing explanation for you at this point. I'll have one at this point because, as I say, you want to incorporate more and more and more features before you say anything final. But certainly it looks like there's something interesting going on there. Just to compare, here's another feature. So this was a feature where, as you can see, Shakespeare really favours the lower end of the range of variation. The Shakespearean genres, in terms of their use of infinitives, really not a lot of difference. They're all three genres bob around within a quite narrow range, whereas there is a whole lot of variation in the comparative corpus. I considered that one an outlier, but otherwise there's at least another 1, 2, 3, 4 that are actually quite close to this other one, and so you have to start to think, all right then, what is the reason for this? Why is it that within the comparative corpus there are certain plays that are such very great users of verbs in the infinitive form? And answering that is a harder question than just looking at numbers, of course. This brings us to the end, and Jonathan isn't scowling at me, so that suggests that we've come in at about the right time. Yeah. The thing that I wanted to stress was that using the corrected part speech tags allows advanced grammatical querying, which opens up analytic possibilities that we wouldn't have had without that additional layer of data that sits alongside the Shakespearean text and the Shakespearean comparative text. Basically, what we've kind of shown how we can distinguish style points where Shakespeare is in family, considered as just one playwright of that period, as opposed to style points where he might stand out. And for the future, as I've already said, we need to bring in more of the advanced features from Biber's list. And we also need to consider the genre distinctions within the comparative plays. We've got that data, but we've not processed it yet. And finally, what's going to be critical in order to explain things is some kind of analysis in situ of the functional load of the features. So it's not enough to say there's a ton of infinitives in this play. We want to have some explanation of what is the function of infinitives that is driving there to be more of them in this particular text. And then, in turn, can we explain why Shakespeare's plays don't seem to have any extreme uses of that particular function. And finally, I'm not going to say very much about this, but there is a possibility that this may be able to inform certain strands of research in authorship attribution. Authorship attribution, even applied to Shakespeare, is still methodologically fairly primitive in that it relies overwhelmingly on word forms and counts of word forms without considering grammatical categories or grammatical constructions or grammatical roles. And there is perhaps some opening for this kind of work to have a beneficial influence there. That is it. Thank you.